The legend of the Old West doesn't mention the smell. It doesn't mention the lice in the beds, the black widow spiders under the outhouse seat, or the single toothbrush shared by every traveler who stopped at the same coaching inn. The stories about cowboys and gunslingers and frontier justice are real, but they left something out. This is what hygiene was really like in the Old West, and it is significantly worse than you are imagining. Before the specific details, understand what you are walking into. The men who arrived in frontier towns after weeks on the cattle trail had not bathed in those weeks. Their clothes hadn't been washed either. Most owned one set. The streets of these famous western towns were not paved. They were packed dirt, mixed daily with horse manure, cattle waste, and whatever else came in off the trail. This is what greeted you arriving in Dodge City or Tombstone, not the cinematic wide street of the showdown. A dirt road that smelled like exactly what it was. The buildings weren't much better. Cramped, poorly ventilated, cooking fires with nowhere for the smoke to go. And then there were the beds. Bed linens in the Old West, when they existed at all, were changed infrequently. Weeks between changes, sometimes months. And what lived in those linens had a nickname that tells you everything you need to know. Seam squirrels. That was the frontier slang for lice, not a rare problem, a standard condition of accommodation. Rose Pender visited the American West between 1883 and 1888 and kept detailed written records of what she found. She described a night where she was woken by a swarm of bugs and barely slept at all. That was a visitor's experience of one bad night. For the people who lived there, that was Tuesday. And lice weren't the only company. Almost no homes had screens on their windows. Flies moved freely between the outhouse, the food table, the sleeping area, and back again. The distinction between inside and outside barely existed, which brings us to the outhouse. And this is where things start to get considerably worse. The outhouse was a fundamental feature of frontier life. A pit dug into the earth, a crude wooden structure above it. When the pit filled, you covered it, moved the structure over a new hole, and started again. Simple. And genuinely grim in the specifics. People tried to deal with the smell using lime or lye. That helped for approximately 5 minutes on a warm afternoon. More persistent were the other occupants. Flies moved between the waste inside and the food in your kitchen without obstacle. And black widow spiders made a habit of nesting in exactly the spot where a person would sit. Being bitten while using an outhouse in the Old West was a documented occupational hazard of daily life. Nobody put that in the dime novels. As for what substituted for toilet paper, leaves, corn cobs, and grass were the practical solutions. The Sears Roebuck catalog, when it eventually arrived, was valued partly for this purpose. But the most serious problem with the outhouse was not the smell or the spiders. It was where they were built. Close to homes, close to wells, close to streams. The waste seeping from those pits was slowly contaminating the water supply, and almost nobody in the Old West understood that this was happening. Finding genuinely clean water in the Wild West was harder than most histories make it sound. Wells were contaminated by nearby outhouses, usually without the people using them ever knowing it. Stagnant water collected in pools that bred flies and insects. Rainwater gathered in cisterns and picked up everything the wind carried into it. And the limited clean water that did exist was used carefully and repeatedly for drinking first, then cooking, then washing dishes, then clothes, often in that same sequence from the same source. The result was cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Throughout the 19th century, these diseases moved through frontier communities with brutal efficiency. Wagon trains crossing the plains were hit hard by cholera outbreaks. When travelers wrote in their journals that there was no sickness in camp, they wrote it with the genuine relief of someone who understood exactly how fast that could change. But disease didn't only spread through the water. Some of the most reliable vectors for illness in the Old West were the places people went deliberately to relax. And the details of what actually happened in those places have been quietly left out of the legend. Every Western film shows you the saloon, the whiskey, the card games, the piano. What they don't show you is what hung along the top of the bar. Running the full length of the counter in most Old West saloons was a shared towel. One towel, used by every man who came in to wipe beer foam from his mouth. Over the course of an evening, that towel moved germs from every patron to every patron who followed, in series all night. The floor was covered in sawdust. The reason for the sawdust was the spitting. Men spit tobacco constantly onto the floor, near the spittoons, but not reliably into them. The sawdust sat damp and contaminated between changes. As tuberculosis and pneumonia spread through the frontier, that wet, spat-upon sawdust became one of their primary vectors. Some towns banned public spitting and imposed significant penalties. Some saloons rented out floor space to travelers, which meant sleeping in the sawdust, in everything that had settled there during the day. If the saloon was one of the more dangerous places in the Old West, the dentist's chair was another. Because in most frontier towns, there was no dentist's chair. When a tooth became bad enough to need removing, you found a barber, sometimes a blacksmith. They used plier-like instruments to pull it out directly, no anesthetic. A swig of whiskey beforehand if you were fortunate. But the detail about dentistry in the Old West that really stops people is this. At coaching stations and public accommodation stops, there was often a community toothbrush. One toothbrush, provided for the use of travelers passing through. Everyone who stopped used it. Between users, it was not sanitized. Food particles from the previous person's teeth were removed by the brush that then went into your mouth, used in series by every traveler who came before you and after you that day. Dental disease in the Old West was not a sign of individual neglect. It was almost structurally unavoidable, and the most accessible methods of dealing with it made everything considerably worse. Here is what the legend consistently gets wrong. Not everyone in the Old West was equally filthy. The gap between the hygiene standards of men and women on the frontier was significant, and it was documented. Cowboys, soldiers, and men on the trail could go weeks without bathing. Their routines made it near impossible, and in winter, bathing in rivers simply wasn't viable. Most owned one set of clothes. When those clothes were washed at all, it was in a stream when the opportunity arose. Women, even without privacy, consistently maintained higher standards. Historical accounts describe women going to springs or streams each morning to wash their faces and laundering their clothes more regularly. Women in the Old West were not only cleaner than men, they were substantially cleaner. In 2005, archaeologists excavating a site in Deadwood found a pair of tweezers. The find pointed to the large Chinese population who worked and lived in Deadwood, who maintained distinct practices, plucking rather than shaving, and other customs that set them apart from the surrounding culture. Hygiene in the Old West was not a single shared experience. It varied enormously by who you were and what you'd brought with you. And then there were the men who, in the middle of all of this, made a point of looking after themselves. Wild Bill Hickok was known for his appearance. George Armstrong Custer reportedly used cinnamon oil in his hair. When cowboys arrived in town after weeks on the trail, the first stops were often the barber, a haircut, a shave, and the bathhouse, where hot water was available for a fee, clean clothes if they could afford them. The contrast between arriving filthy and leaving clean was sharp enough that travelers wrote about it. That contrast tells you something important. The people who lived in the Old West knew what cleanliness felt like. They weren't indifferent to it. They just had almost no reliable way to maintain it. The legends of the Old West are built on real events and real people. The gunfights happened. The outlaws were genuine. The lawmen were dangerous. None of that is myth. But the version of those stories that survived left out the physical reality of the world those people lived in every day. The smell walking into Dodge City, the seam squirrels in the beds, the shared towel along the bar, the community toothbrush at the coaching stop, the black widow spiders under the outhouse seat, the cholera moving silently through the water supply from a pit someone dug 10 feet from the well. These weren't the failures of careless people. They were the conditions of a frontier that offered genuine freedom and extraordinary hardship at exactly the same time. The people who survived it were tougher than the legend gives them credit for. Because the legend only told you the part it thought you wanted to hear.